The smoke tasted like burning oil and fear, thick and acrid, forcing Captain Jake Riley to choke down a lungful as he banked his P-51 Mustang, Valkyrie, hard to starboard. It wasn't the distant smoke from the industrial targets below, now reduced to crumbling slag heaps miles beneath the clouds. It was the immediate, visceral smoke of exploded American hope. 3 B-17 flying fortresses, mere seconds ago magnificent silver giants of the sky, were now screaming metal fountains cascading down into the Reich, their escort decimated, their crews fragmented across the hostile German landscape. Riley was supposed to be part of the protective screen, the high cover for the bombers returning from the brutal, deep strike mission over Luna. But the enemy had come in overwhelming numbers, and worse, with a brutal, coordinated ferocity they hadn't displayed since the worst days of 1943. He had watched Major Turner's Mustang vanish beneath a swarm of dark, camouflaged shapes, Focke-Wulf 190s, heavy, fast, and armed like flying destroyers. Now the remnants of the escort group were scattered, fleeing toward the relative safety of the coast, their fuel gauges protesting the prolonged, high-power engagement. Riley's fuel was adequate, but his ammunition was dangerously low after saving a crippled 17 moments ago. And then he saw them. Not 2, not 4, but a cohesive, terrifying formation cutting through the hazy afternoon light, perfectly positioned above him and the last functioning bomber limping away toward the west. 10 black crosses. 10 Focke-Wulf 190s, led by what looked like a veteran, judging by the intricate spiral paint pattern on the cowling of the lead aircraft. They were coming not for the easy B-17 kill, but for the solitary, separated Mustang that had lingered too long, acting as a futile, desperate rear guard. Riley was alone. The radio crackled with useless static, the airwaves saturated with panic chatter and German victory boasts. 10 against 1. This wasn't combat. This was a slaughter waiting to happen. The sheer impossibility of the odds settled over him, not as a blanket of despair, but as a razor-sharp clarity. His squadron leader, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, a man who believed strictly in calculated risk and disciplined withdrawal, had often dismissed Riley's aggressive tendencies as borderline crazy. "You don't fight fair, Riley. You fight smart. And surviving 10 is not smart. It's a miracle only God can provide." Riley's teeth ground together, the metallic taste of adrenaline mixing with the stale oxygen in his mask. He feathered his throttle slightly, dropping Valkyrie into a shallow dive, aiming to build speed, the only commodity he truly owned now against the heavy 190s. The German lead plane dipped its nose. The hunt was on. And Jake Riley realized with a chilling certainty that if he didn't win, no one would ever know exactly how terrifyingly alone he felt in that vast, empty sky, surrounded by the ghosts of his fallen comrades and the hard, unrelenting reality of 10 gun sights aimed solely at his cockpit. The first pass was a test of nerve, a brutal calculation of deflection and closing speed that demanded immediate, perfect execution. The Focke-Wulfs were using their superior diving speed, forming a classic finger-4 echelon, with a secondary element peeling off to cover the primary attack. Riley didn't try to outrun them. He knew the 190s, especially at medium altitude, could keep pace, and turning would only bleed his precious speed. Instead, he forced the issue. He pushed Valkyrie into a steep, accelerating dive, aiming his descent path directly toward the approaching formation, a move bordering on suicidal. The German pilots, trained to expect evasion, hesitated for a crucial half-second, unwilling to engage in a head-on collision with a fighter already committed to high speed. That hesitation was all Riley needed. He opened fire not on the lead, but on the third aircraft in the echelon, knowing the lead was prepared for his attack while the wingman was focused on maintaining position. The burst was short, disciplined, and devastating. 6.5 caliber rounds ripped into the Focke-Wulf's engine cowling, tearing away vital components and instantly turning the Pratt & Whitney engine into a smoking wreck. The German pilot yanked his stick back in panic, climbing vertically into the path of his own element. Chaos erupted. The number 4 man, trying to avoid the cripple, pulled too hard and stalled slightly. Riley, now pulling out of his dive at maximum G-force, his vision momentarily graying out from the pressure, saw the opportunity. He utilized the tremendous climbing power of the Merlin engine, snapping Valkyrie into a vertical climb, gaining nearly 2,000 feet before he was forced to level off. When he did, he was behind the stalled German fighter. Another short burst, barely 3 seconds, and the 190 exploded into a brilliant fireball, corkscrewing downward. 2 down, 8 to go. The remaining 8 Germans, witnessing the swift, brutal elimination of 2 comrades in less than 90 seconds, dropped their organized precision. This wasn't a panicked straggler. This was a hungry, angry predator fighting back. The German leader, highly disciplined, immediately restructured his remaining forces, splitting them into 2 groups of 4. One group maintained altitude, while the second group began a coordinated diving attack pattern, determined to pin Riley low and bleed his energy. Riley, now dangerously low on energy after his high G maneuvers, knew he couldn't stay and fight the combined force. He needed cover, and more importantly, he needed to reset the battle, forcing the enemy to break their formation and fight him one-on-one. His eyes scanned the horizon, spotting a massive churning front of cumulus clouds miles ahead. A desperate, risky gamble formed in his mind. Lead them into the storm, disappear, and re-emerge where they least expected him. But first, he had to survive the next 3 minutes, because the lead German flight was already on his tail, the terrifying sight of their cannon flashes beginning to sparkle in his mirrors. He slammed the throttle to the firewall, praying the supercharger held, committing to a flat-out run toward the churning, dark-bellied clouds that promised either salvation or total confusion, and ultimately, destruction. The chase became a desperate, high-speed sprint across the desolate, cloud-dappled plains of central Germany. Riley pushed the P-51 to its absolute limit, the Merlin engine screaming in protest at the sustained overload, its magnificent sound briefly masking the terrifying thud of 20mm cannon shells exploding harmlessly just yards behind his tail. The 4 Focke-Wulfs pursuing him were relentless, their pilots determined to keep him in their sights, but their heavier airframes meant they struggled slightly more to maintain the P-51's top speed and level flight. This small difference gave Riley a precious margin. He flew low, skimming the tops of small wooded ridges and using industrial smoke plumes as fleeting visual cover, constantly weaving and changing altitude by mere feet to disrupt the Germans' aiming solutions. He knew he was bleeding energy, but he was also burning German fuel, forcing them into a longer, more draining pursuit. Finally, the wall of weather materialized ahead, a mountainous, bruised formation of clouds, promising turbulence and near-zero visibility. Riley cut the throttle slightly, dropping his flaps partially, slowing just enough to enter the cloud bank without tearing Valkyrie apart. The transition was violent. Light vanished, replaced by an instantaneous, blinding gray-white soup. The cockpit instruments became his only reality. The artificial horizon, the airspeed indicator, and the turn and bank coordinator demanding absolute, flawless attention. He immediately executed a series of seemingly random maneuvers, a sharp climbing turn to the right, followed by a sudden shallow dive to the left, designed to disorient anyone immediately behind him. The sound of the Germans entering the cloud bank was unmistakable. The distant, muffled roar of their engines, then the terrifying near-miss shriek of a Focke-Wulf streaking past, close enough to shake Valkyrie violently. Riley pulled up into the deepest, darkest heart of the cloud structure, relying on the P-51's superior high-altitude performance and the belief that the Germans would be less willing to engage in blind combat within the turbulent, icy core. He had successfully shaken the immediate pursuers, but the tactical situation remained dire. The other 4 Focke-Wulfs were still maintaining altitude above the cloud bank, patrolling the periphery, patiently waiting for the American fool to emerge. Riley knew he couldn't simply wait out the situation. He was trapped, but he was also concealed. He spent 5 terrifying minutes inside the cloud, flying entirely on instruments, listening to the unsettling silence occasionally broken by the violent shaking of his aircraft in the unseen updrafts. This moment of isolation was crucial. It allowed him to calculate the precise moment and angle for his re-entry into the fight. He knew the Germans would be watching the edges of the main cloud mass, assuming he would burst out at high speed. He decided on the crazy part of the plan. He would exit slowly, deliberately, and far lower than expected, using the cloud's heavy shadow as cover before snapping into a vertical attack run from below. He pushed the stick forward, plunging into the dark, rain-streaked bottom of the storm, aiming for the sudden, dangerous clearing below, preparing to trade the safety of concealment for the deadly surprise of the ambush. 7 enemies remained, and the cost of his strategy had already been a nearly fatal level of stress and disorientation. 87 seconds. That was the window Riley calculated he had before the waiting German patrols above realized he hadn't popped out of the main cloud mass. He burst out of the cloud base not in a high-speed run, but in a controlled, low-altitude glide, his camouflage blending almost perfectly with the darkened earth beneath the storm. He flew dead flat for 30 seconds, the ground rushing past mere hundreds of feet below his wings, searching the sky above. There they were, 4 Focke-Wulfs circling patiently at 15,000 feet, their formation loose but disciplined, guarding the expected exit point. The other 3 from the initial chase must have given up the direct pursuit and were likely climbing back up to join the patrol. Riley knew he couldn't take on all 7 simultaneously, not in this energy-depleted state. He needed to pick off the high cover first, destabilizing the entire enemy formation. He eased the stick back, pouring power into the Merlin, beginning a long, shallow, high-speed climb. He was aiming for the sun, or what little light there was left filtering through the edge of the receding storm. His plan hinged on the element of surprise. They were looking down, not up. He held his fire, every ounce of his concentration fixed on maintaining the perfect rate of climb and intercept angle. The P-51, renowned for its altitude capabilities, began to truly shine. He closed the vertical gap quickly. At 12,000 feet, the German quartet finally registered the anomaly, a flash of silver climbing impossibly fast beneath them. They reacted instantly, two diving to intercept, the other two braking right. Riley pressed the trigger. The targets were diving, creating a challenging deflection shot, but he aimed not at the cockpit, but at the wing root of the leading interceptor. A solid burst impacted the starboard wing. There was no explosion, just a massive sheet of stressed metal peeling back violently from the leading edge, ripping the aileron assembly to shreds. The 190 immediately snapped into an uncontrolled, violent spin, descending rapidly. The pilot didn't bail out. The G-forces must have been too much. 6 left. The second interceptor, recognizing the danger of the head-on pass, pulled up sharply, exposing his vulnerable belly momentarily. Riley, in a masterpiece of kinetic control, snap-rolled Valkyrie onto its back and fired. He missed the cockpit, but raked the fuselage. Smoke poured instantly from the engine, turning black and thick. The German pilot bailed out immediately, a tiny silhouette detaching from the plane and jerking violently as his parachute deployed into the turbulent air. 5 left. But the cost was heavy. The remaining high-cover pair were now maneuvering into a firing position. And worse, the 3 Germans who had been chasing him in the clouds had successfully climbed back up and were approaching from the west, completing the encirclement. Riley was now fighting 5 planes, but 3 were converging rapidly, while 2 were already firing. He was truly cornered, caught between a rock and a hard place, high over enemy territory, and his engine, after the prolonged abuse, was beginning to sputter menacingly. The gauge flickered, a dangerous sign that fuel starvation might be moments away due to the violent maneuvers. He had destroyed 4 fighters, but the fight had only just begun its most lethal phase. The fight now devolved into a swirling, dizzying ballet of death, a continuous high-G turning engagement where victory hinged entirely on the fractional advantage of the P-51's laminar flow wing and Riley's superhuman stamina. He was no longer thinking about fuel or the shuddering protests of his engine. He was operating purely on instinct, a deep-seated refusal to submit to the overwhelming odds. He recognized the pattern instantly. The 5 remaining Germans had executed a perfect Lufbury circle, forcing him to keep turning inside their radius. If he lagged even for a second, one of the trailing 190s would get a clean shot. Riley pressed his face hard against the gun sight rubber, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps against the sustained G-load. He saw the flashes of the enemy guns, not just tracer fire, but the deadly dark puffs of 20mm cannon shells exploding around him. A sudden, sharp crack and shudder rocked the Valkyrie. His left main landing gear warning light flashed angrily, indicating a hydraulic line or structural damage. He'd taken a hit in the wing root. Blood was pounding in his ears, and the pain radiating from his shoulders and neck was almost paralyzing. He had to break the circle. And here is where the crazy truly manifested. Instead of tightening his turn, which would eventually bleed all his speed, Riley momentarily released the stick, allowing the plane to drift wide, deliberately allowing one of the Focke-Wulfs to draw a bead on him. The German pilot, confident in his shot, tightened his own turn for the kill. At the exact moment the German began his burst, Riley slammed the stick hard over and kicked the rudder, executing a violent, uncontrolled Dury turn that nearly ripped the wings off his Mustang. He slid out of the line of fire, but the enemy pilot, caught entirely by surprise, overshot. Riley, now dangerously close to stalling, inverted Valkyrie and fired directly into the underside of the overshooting 190.
The cannon shells found the vulnerable radiator and fuel tanks. The Focke-Wulf immediately exploded in a magnificent sheet of flame, its engine torn clean away. 4 left. The sudden violent maneuver completely shattered the Lufbury circle, forcing the remaining pilots to scramble and re-engage, momentarily losing their coordination. Riley seized the moment, climbing vertically away from the chaos. But let me stop you here for a moment. Amidst the chaos of this desperate fight, we often talk about the bravery of these men, but what about the line between bravery and insanity? When the odds are 10 to 1 and logic dictates surrender or retreat, what deep internal force drives a pilot to willingly choose to stay and fight until the last bullet, knowing the probability of survival is near zero? Is that professional commitment or something far more primal? I genuinely want to know what you think. If you were Captain Riley, staring down 10 gun sights, would you have sought the high ground, or would you have pulled that crazy stunt to shatter their formation? Share your thoughts on that impossible choice in the comments below. For Jake Riley, there was no choice. Survival meant winning, and winning meant taking the risk. He pushed his damaged Mustang higher, seeking the altitude advantage he had sacrificed, knowing the 3 remaining pilots were now hunting him with pure, murderous intent.
The engine continued its distressed, stuttering cough, a rhythmic reminder of the damage sustained and the brutal reality of low fuel pressure, exacerbated by the high G maneuvers. Riley checked the fuel gauge, dangerously close to the red line. He was fighting on fumes and nerve. The remaining 4 Focke-Wulfs were commanded by the initial leader, the one with the spiral-painted cowling, who was now visibly enraged by the loss of 6 aircraft to a single American Mustang. This German ace, whose name Riley would later learn was Hauptmann Ernst Keller, was not making tactical mistakes. He was simply encountering a level of desperation and skill he hadn't anticipated. Keller led a synchronized attack. 2 190s attacked from the 10 o'clock high position, utilizing the sun's glare, while Keller and his wingman maintained a flanking position ready to jump Riley if he committed to a hard turn either way. Riley was trapped in the center of a lethal diamond formation. He couldn't climb, and diving would just increase the speed of the pursuit. He chose the most direct, aggressive countermeasure. He flew straight into the path of the diving pair. It was pure chicken. He opened fire early, aiming for the massive radial engine of the closest Focke-Wulf. He fired a long, continuous burst, emptying nearly a third of his remaining ammunition into the target. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The German aircraft disintegrated in a violent explosion, the sheer power of the .50 caliber rounds ripping the engine block apart. The resulting shrapnel struck the second diving 190, tearing jagged holes in its wing and briefly distracting the pilot. 3 left. Riley immediately pitched nose up into a high yo-yo, sacrificing his speed for altitude, forcing Keller and his wingman to execute difficult climbing turns to stay with him. This maneuver was designed to bleed the energy of the heavier Focke-Wulfs. The wounded 190, unable to maintain altitude, began gliding toward the ground, its pilot desperately attempting to restart his crippled engine. Riley focused solely on Keller and his wingman. Keller, demonstrating exceptional piloting skill, held his turn tight, positioning himself perfectly on Riley's 6 o'clock. The distance closed rapidly, and Riley could see the German pilot's helmet and goggles clearly in the sun. This was the moment of truth. Riley executed a maneuver he had only practiced in theory, the lag pursuit roll. Instead of turning to face Keller,
He rolled slightly past the vertical and dropped the nose, allowing the Mustang to fall rapidly out of the turn, drawing Keller even closer. When Keller followed, Riley slammed the throttle forward and pulled a crushing 7G turn, forcing Keller to try to match the turn radius or overshoot. The Focke-Wulf, unable to sustain the turn at such high G, snapped into a partial stall. Riley immediately corrected, his guns blazing, firing directly across Keller's nose. He missed Keller, but he caught Keller's wingman, who was trailing slightly and trying desperately to cover his leader. The wingman's Focke-Wulf erupted in flames, spiraling down, the 7th confirmed kill. 2 left. Keller, now truly alone with a damaged, sputtering engine of his own, had seen enough of his squadron obliterated by this singular, crazy American. He pulled back hard on the stick, executing a high-speed brake, desperate to disengage and flee the scene of his catastrophic defeat. Riley had to decide, pursue the fleeing ace or save his dwindling fuel and damaged aircraft. He chose pursuit. The pursuit of Hauptmann Keller was less about vengeance and more about ensuring the complete dissolution of the threat. Riley couldn't afford for this experienced German ace to limp back to base and relay the Americans' critical weakness, that the Mustang was nearly out of ammunition and struggling for fuel. Keller pushed his Focke-Wulf towards the sanctuary of a dense ground fog bank, gathering near a river valley. Riley stayed close, refusing to let the gap widen. The damage indicator on the Valkyrie was screaming silent warnings. The hydraulic pressure was sinking, making the controls sluggish, and the engine temperature was dangerously high. If he pulled one more aggressive maneuver, the Merlin might seize entirely. Yet he pressed the attack. He closed to within 300 yards, a perfect firing range, but he held his trigger finger, conserving the precious few rounds he had remaining. He noticed Keller was flying erratically, attempting to shake Riley by weaving violently, suggesting the German aircraft had also taken a hit during the close quarters maneuvering. Riley didn't need to destroy the plane. He just needed to disable the pilot or the engine. He aimed his final decisive burst not at the cockpit, but at the tail control surfaces, knowing that damage there would render the high-speed Focke-Wulf uncontrollable. At 150 yards, Riley mashed the trigger, a final, rattling 3-second burst that felt like the last sigh of his gun batteries. The tracer round streamed true. They stitched a line across the Focke-Wulf's vertical stabilizer and horizontal elevator. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. The entire tail assembly shuddered violently, then snapped, separating from the fuselage with a catastrophic wrench of metal. Hauptmann Keller's plane tumbled wildly, a victim of uncontrollable aerodynamics, spinning end over end until it smashed into the ground in a distant, silent puff of dust and smoke. 8 confirmed. Riley circled once, confirming the destruction. He knew that 2 wounded German pilots who had bailed out or were gliding toward a forced landing near the clouds counted as operational kills, removing the enemy from the fight. 10 enemy fighters neutralized by 1 damaged Mustang. The silence that followed was deafening. A profound emptiness that contrasted sharply with the minutes of violent, high-G chaos. The sky was suddenly empty, save for the silent, majestic presence of Valkyrie, now visibly battered, trailing faint wisps of coolant and protesting loudly with every movement of the stick. Riley finally allowed himself to breathe deeply. His body screamed in agony. His ribs felt bruised. His arms were leaden, and a headache hammered behind his eyes. He checked his ammunition counter. Empty. Fuel, barely enough to reach the channel, let alone cross it if he encountered headwinds. He was still hundreds of miles deep within enemy territory, in an aircraft held together by sheer willpower and American engineering. And the long, agonizing flight home was now the greatest challenge remaining. He set his course for the English coast, flying slowly, gently, praying for smooth air and an invisible passage, knowing that the greatest battle was over, but the final, delicate requirement, survival, was yet to be secured. He desperately missed the sound of another American voice on the radio, but he had to maintain radio silence, unwilling to alert any secondary German defenses that a crippled prey was attempting to escape the trap.
The flight across the Reich was an exercise in pure, sustained anxiety. Riley babied the Merlin engine, keeping the RPMs low, the boost minimal, conserving every drop of dwindling 100-octane fuel. He flew southwest, using the rising sun to his advantage when possible, but mostly hugging the low-altitude terrain. Features rivers, forests, and small villages, anything to break up his silhouette against the vast expanse of the German countryside. The damage to Valkyrie became increasingly apparent. The controls were mushy due to the hydraulic damage. Every adjustment was met with a dangerous delay, forcing him to anticipate his corrections far in advance. The structural damage to the left wing root worried him most. Every bump of turbulence sent a painful vibration through the airframe, a reminder that the wing might separate at any moment if subjected to high stress. He pulled down the oxygen mask briefly, swallowing hard, trying to alleviate the nausea brought on by the prolonged stress and G-forces. His throat was dry, his uniform soaked in sweat, and his fingers were cramped and rigid on the control column. Hours stretched into an eternity. He spotted German airfields and flak installations, but their proximity offered him no choice but to continue. He watched other, distant contrails high above him, likely German transports or late-returning fighters, but they remained unaware of the lone, crippled American ghost skimming the treetops below. The mental effort required to maintain this low, steady, perfect flight path, avoiding any abrupt movements that might aggravate the structural damage, was almost harder than the fight itself. He thought about the B-17 crew he had tried to protect, the men whose mission he had ultimately helped secure by drawing off the fighter defense. He thought about Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, the CO who had called him crazy for his aggressive tactics. If he survived this, Riley wondered what Hayes would say now. Could a victory so improbable, so costly in personal risk, ever be considered smart piloting? Or was it simply the reckless desperation that sometimes defines true heroism? As the coastline finally emerged on the horizon, a thin, hazy blue line promising the English Channel, Riley felt a surge of relief so profound it nearly brought him to tears, quickly followed by the cold dread of the Channel crossing. He had calculated his fuel margin rigorously. It would be razor thin. If the wind was against him, he was going into the drink. He eased Valkyrie over the coastal defenses, bracing for the inevitable scattered flak. Miraculously, he passed through unmolested, leaving the territory of the enemy behind him and flying out over the cold, gray expanse of the sea. This body of water, usually a welcome sight, now looked like a massive,
hungry grave waiting for the slightest mistake.
The Channel crossing was a 25-minute eternity, defined by the rhythmic sputter and catch of the Merlin engine, a sound that now represented the difference between life and death. Riley had to nurse the engine continuously, adjusting the mixture control with the precision of a watchmaker to maximize every cubic centimeter of fuel vapor. The P-51's coolant temperature gauge was dangerously high, and he knew that pushing the engine even slightly harder would mean catastrophic failure. He flew at minimum effective altitude, just above the wave tops, trying to take advantage of the ground effect for aerodynamic efficiency. He searched the horizon for any sign of Allied support, or, failing that, the blessed white cliffs of Dover. The radio remained stubbornly silent. He couldn't risk transmitting his position in case any lurking enemy aircraft had survived the long day of combat. But the lack of communication also amplified the feeling of profound isolation. He talked to the plane, whispering encouragement to the struggling engine, pleading with the damaged wing to hold steady. "Just a little further, Valkyrie, just enough." The salt spray lashed against his canopy, mixing with the smears of oil and grime accumulated during the aerial fight. He felt the cold seeping through the thin layers of his uniform, the fatigue pressing down on him like a physical weight. Then, far off in the mist, he saw it, the unmistakable silhouette of a Spitfire, then another. They were patrolling the convoy routes, and their presence meant he was safe. He flicked his radio switch to transmit, his voice hoarse and barely audible. "Hello? Any traffic? This is Mustang, P-51, call sign Valkyrie, requesting vector, crippled, low on fuel." The response was immediate, laced with surprise and urgency. "Valkyrie, you're off course. Where in the hell have you been, son? We marked you down as MIA hours ago. We have your visual. Follow us in. We'll guide you to Manston." He had made it, but the final challenge remained, landing a heavily damaged aircraft. He followed the Spitfire Escort, the relief flooding his system, making him momentarily lightheaded. As they approached the Manston airfield, Riley lowered his flaps. They moved sluggishly, a terrifying testament to the ruined hydraulics. He pumped the handle to extend the landing gear, but only the starboard wheel locked into place. The port gear hung uselessly, refusing to deploy. A belly landing was inevitable, a fiery, high-speed disaster in a fuel-laden plane. He calmly informed the tower. The ground crew immediately foamed the runway. The Spitfire pilots circled overhead, watching the impossible finale. Riley brought the Mustang in low, slow, and level, stalling the engine just feet above the tarmac. He touched down gently on the single wheel, holding the damaged left wing high for as long as possible. Finally, with a horrible, protesting shriek of metal, the left wing scraped the runway, followed by the crunch of the propeller tearing into the ground, sparking violently. The Mustang skidded, spun, and finally slammed to a halt in a shower of foam and debris. Silence. Then the rush of ambulances and fire trucks. Riley, exhausted, covered in sweat and oil, managed to push open the ruined canopy and climb out onto the wing, waving weakly at the gathering crowd. He was alive. A 10-plane battle was over. The immediate aftermath at Manston was a blur of medical checks, hot coffee that tasted like heaven, and the wide-eyed, disbelieving stares of the ground crew and intelligence officers. The Mustang Valkyrie was towed to the hangar, where engineers immediately swarmed the wreck, documenting the evidence of the impossible duel. They found 8 visible entry and exit wounds from 20mm cannon fire, a ruined hydraulic system, structural fatigue in the left wing spar so severe it was a miracle it held, and an almost entirely empty ammunition box.
Less than 50 rounds remained across all guns. The fuel tanks were nearly dry. The reserve gauge was pinned firmly on empty. When Riley finally made it to the debriefing, still shaky but coherent, the intelligence officer listened to the detailed account of the 10-plane engagement with a mixture of awe and professional skepticism. 10 Focke-Wulfs, Captain, solo? You confirmed 8 destroyed and 2 damaged or forced down? The official records of the day were horrifying. The entire bomber force had taken a beating, and every squadron had suffered losses. A claim of 10 kills by 1 damaged pilot far behind enemy lines seemed utterly unbelievable, bordering on the delusion his CO Hayes had jokingly attributed to him. But the hard evidence began to trickle in. Photographic reconnaissance from the next day, tasked with assessing the Luna strike, returned images of scattered wreckage precisely where Riley had indicated. Too many wrecks, in fact, to be accounted for by the general action. More critically, signals intelligence intercepted frantic German communications detailing the complete loss of a high-value Staffel commanded by the renowned Hauptmann Keller, claiming they were wiped out by an unidentified, demonically aggressive single American fighter. The German report mentioned the American pilot fighting with the recklessness of a man who believed himself already dead, confirming the crazy tactics Riley had employed. When Lieutenant Colonel Hayes arrived the next morning, expecting to officially list Riley as missing in action, presumed killed, he found his borderline crazy pilot sipping coffee, surrounded by a gaggle of admiring flight surgeons and debriefing officers. Hayes inspected the ruined Valkyrie. The plane was a write-off, a testament to the brutal, sustained violence of the fight. He looked at Riley, seeing not the reckless youth he had cautioned, but a man aged 20 years by an impossible hour of combat. Hayes didn't offer a reprimand or even a formal compliment. He simply shook his hand, his gaze heavy with understanding, and said, "The record books will call it a miracle, Riley, but I think they'll just call you crazy."